Hallelujah. Shabbat Shalom, saints.
Shabbat Shalom.
Hallelujah. Welcome to the Miqra. We here at the Miqra are proclaiming the foundations of the faith and the ancient paths.
Hallelujah.
Hallelujah, because we know that this is what pleases the Father. He has given us a record of what happened from the beginning, the record of people that have pleased Him, a record of His word to His people, and all of that is for our benefit, for our growth, for our encouragement. And we're not to forsake anything that He has spoken from His mouth. He's given us all of that word, and again, from Isaiah 55, He's going to fulfill every word that proceeds from His mouth. It's going to accomplish that for which He sent it. And so we're proclaiming those ancient paths, those ancient ways, the instructions that the Father spoke with His own mouth. And the Messiah, contrary to what some people would say, Messiah never abrogated or annulled those commandments and those words that were spoken by the Father. Messiah came to explain and to fulfill. He came to walk out those things and to teach His disciples. Because the religious leaders of the day were teaching another Torah, another law, another way of worshiping, which was not the way the Father had given, and which does not accomplish salvation for His people. And so the Messiah came to straighten the record and to clear up any misunderstanding about what pleases the Father. And so He's given to us His instructions and His way of life. And so that's what we seek. We seek to know the Father through His ancient paths. Today our teaching is going to be like a part 2 of last week's teachings on the parables. And I've entitled this teaching, Mysteries of the Kingdom in the Parables of Yahusha. Messiah reveals the mysteries. I want to begin with a little bit of a review, and that is from Nebuchadnezzar's dream in Daniel chapter 2. And I want to read verses 27 through 30, because this explains to us how the Father wants us to understand the mysteries. So, Daniel chapter 2, verses 27 through 30. Daniel answered before the king, King Nebuchadnezzar, and said, "The secret or mystery which the king is asking, the wise ones, the astrologers, the magicians, and the diviners are unable to show it to the king. But there is an Elohim in the heavens who reveals secrets. And He has made known to King Nebuchadnezzar what is to be in the latter days. Your dream and the visions upon your head, upon your bed, were these. As for you, O king, on your bed your thoughts came up. What is going to take place after this? And He who reveals secrets has made known to you what shall be after this. Now, as for me, this secret, this mystery, has not been revealed to me, because I have more wisdom than anyone living, but for our sakes, who has made known the interpretation to the king, and that you should know the thoughts of your heart, King Nebuchadnezzar." And so there is an Elohim in heaven that reveals mysteries, that reveals secrets, that tells us what is to come. And that's a reassuring thought, because He knows what is to come, because it's all part of His plan. He's the one that is orchestrating world events and how the future gets played out in the history of our future, because He's going to bring in an everlasting kingdom. And Nebuchadnezzar's dream was kind of the first taste of what is going to be, because Nebuchadnezzar saw in his dream a representation of the 4 world kingdoms that would arise. And then in verse 44, at the end of an explanation of those 4 world kingdoms, it says, "In the time of those kings, The Elohim of heaven will set up a kingdom that will never be destroyed, nor will it be left to another people. It will crush all those kingdoms and bring them to an end, but it will itself endure forever. And so the ultimate goal of world history and the world kingdoms is to bring in an everlasting kingdom, the kingdom of Elohim. In Daniel's vision in chapter 7, there's an explanation of the four great beasts that Daniel saw in his vision. And in verses 17 and 18 it says the four great beasts are four kingdoms that will rise from the earth. Again, these are the four world kingdoms, man-made kingdoms that Nebuchadnezzar saw in his dream. But it says the saints of the Most High will receive the kingdom and will possess it forever. Yes, forever and ever. And so this is a revelation of the mystery of dreams and visions and of all that the prophets have seen and have been searching for and trying to understand, even the very words that they were given to speak and to write down. It is the kingdom of Elohim that is coming. And the kingdom of Elohim, rest assured, will come because it's all in the Almighty's plan, the one who controls heaven and earth. And we can say that the adversary is the king of the air and that he has certain sway in many things. But it's only by the permission of the Father that the enemy is able to do anything. And ultimately, the Father in heaven, creator of heaven and earth, the life giver, is the one who has the final say in all of these things. And his kingdom will be an everlasting kingdom. So Paul, and the focus of our teaching again this week is going to be seeing parables and mysteries that were spoken in the Old Testament and also by the Messiah, and then seeing a correlation in what Paul teaches, just to bring to a fullness what Paul really is teaching. And I'm going to talk about parables in a minute, but Paul says this about that mystery of his will, of which Nebuchadnezzar and of course Daniel in his interpretation of the king's dreams revealed, and that is this. Ephesians chapter 1 verses 9 and 10, he made known to us the mystery of his will according to his good pleasure. The mystery of his will is all about bringing in his kingdom. And this has been part of the plan all along, which he purposed in Messiah to be put into effect when the times will have reached their fulfillment, to bring all things in heaven and on earth together under one head, even Messiah. And so in this kingdom, which was part of the dream of Nebuchadnezzar and part of the vision of Daniel, the ultimate goal, again, of human history is to bring everything together, all heaven and earth, back under one head, the Messiah in the kingdom of Elohim here on the earth. And this is what Paul says, the mystery of his will. There's another mystery in Paul, jumping over to Ephesians chapter 3. Paul says, surely you have heard about the administration of Elohim's grace that was given to me for you. That is the mystery made known to me by revelation, as I have already written briefly. And the mystery that was made known to Paul was not a new revelation, but it was revealed to Paul through what was made known, again, in the Tanakh, the Old Testament, and through the Messiah, Yahusha. And again, we're going to look at some of those things in the parables. In reading this, then, you will be able to understand my insight into the mystery of Messiah, which was not made known to men in other generations, as it has now been revealed by the Spirit of Elohim's holy apostles and prophets. This mystery is that through the gospel, through the preaching of the everlasting gospel, the Gentiles are heirs together with Israel, members together of one body, sharers together in the promise in Messiah Yahusha. And so really the promises that were given to Abraham are fulfilled really into our future when Messiah inherits that which belongs to him, and that all who belong to him, all who have attached themselves to him, become heirs together with the Messiah in this kingdom. Through the seed, who is Messiah, shares together in the promises and members together of that one body that the prophet spoke of. So when Yahushua Messiah brought parables, he had this explanation of why he spoke in parables. And I want to introduce this before we're going to review a couple of the parables and then summarize them. You know, I was, after I brought the teaching last week about the parables, for a couple of days I couldn't stop thinking about them. I would, wake up in the middle of the night and Father would put these things on my heart and mind. And so I feel like the Father wanted me to review last week's teaching and then bring some new things to the table, because it's important that we understand that all these mysteries were revealed by the Messiah, because a lot of churches teach that Paul is the one that revealed all these mysteries. Not so. Paul was repeating and clarifying and bringing from his own point of view what the Messiah had already taught in revealing these mysteries of the kingdom of Elohim. And so Yahushua spoke all these things to the crowd in parables. He did not say anything to them without using a parable. So was fulfilled what was spoken through the prophet: I will open my mouth in parables. I will utter things hidden since the creation of the world. He who has ears, let him hear. And the disciples came to him and said, why do you speak to the people in parables? And he replied, the knowledge of the secrets or mysteries of the kingdom of heaven has been given to you, but not to them. Whoever has will be given more, and he will have an abundance. Whoever does not have, even what he has will be taken from him. And so it's on account of the hardness of the heart that people can hear the words spoken by the Messiah. They can hear those parables, but they misinterpret because they don't understand, on account of the hardness of their heart. And that's what the Messiah is quoting Isaiah the prophet here in these next couple of slides. And this is what it amounts to. This is why I speak to them in parables, the Messiah said. Though seeing they do not see, and though hearing they do not hear or understand. In them is fulfilled the prophecy of Yeshayahu, Isaiah. Yeshayahu means the salvation of Yahu, or the salvation of Yah. That's what his name means. Yeshayahu, or Isaiah we call him in English. And this is what Isaiah said: you will ever be hearing but never understanding. You will be ever seeing but never perceiving, for this people's heart has become calloused. They hardly hear with their ears, and they have closed their eyes. Otherwise they might see with their eyes, hear with their ears, understand with their hearts, and turn, and I would heal them. But blessed are your eyes because they see, and your ears because they hear. For I tell you the truth, many prophets and righteous men longed to see what you see, but did not see it, and to hear what you hear, but did not hear it. And so it was on account of the hardness of Israel. And we're going to take a look starting with the next slide, we're going to look at Psalm 78, and it tells a parable. It's the parable of Israel's hardness of heart. It tells kind of a brief history of how the sons of Israel received the word. Even that first generation that came out of Egypt hardened their heart and were denied access to the promised land. And over again throughout the history of Israel, the people would repent when they fell upon hard times and when the other nations would attack them and persecute them. And then they would repent for a brief season, but they'd fall right back into their old ways of hardening their hearts and trying to live like the Gentile nations around them. And so they wanted to worship in the way that the Gentiles worship their gods. They wanted to have the idols and the gods of Egypt. And so over and over again, the prophets had to rebuke the people and try to bring them back into an understanding that they needed to follow Yahweh's ways and not the ways of the nations who are around them. And so we go to Psalm 78. This is the parable of Israel's hardness of heart. And I'm going to read the whole of Psalm 78 because we've talked about some of these things before, but it bears, again, repeating. We haven't read through Psalm 78 as we're going to do today. And it tells, it's written in the form of a parable, but it tells us something that we need to understand about Elohim's plan. And we're gonna look at what Yahusha kind of responded to this parable and the hardness of Israel's heart, as did Paul in the book of Romans. So, Psalm 78. It says it's a maskil of Asaph. And it says this, "O my people, hear my teaching. Listen to the words of my mouth. I will open my mouth in parables. I will utter hidden things, things from of old, what we have heard and known, what our fathers have told us." And so this parable is a description of Israel's response to those things that the Father revealed from the beginning onward. The teachings, the way of righteousness, the way of relationship with the living Elohim, the way of redemption and salvation. But the people heard and knew these things. Our fathers related them to us. And then verse 4 says, "We do not hide them from their children, relating to the generation to come the praises of Yahweh and his strength and his wonders which he has done. For he raised a witness in Yaakov, in Jacob, and set a Torah in Israel, which he commanded our fathers to teach them to their children, that it might be made known to a generation to come, to children who would be born, to rise up and relate them to their children, and place their trust in Elohim, and not forget the works of El, but watch over his commands, and not be like their fathers, a stubborn and rebellious generation, a generation which did not prepare its heart, whose spirit was not steadfast to El. The children of Ephraim, armed bowmen, turned back in the day of battle. They did not guard the covenant of Elohim, and they refused to walk in his Torah, and they forgot his deeds and his wonders which he had shown them. He did wonders in the sight of their fathers in the land of Mitzrayim, in the field of Zoan. He split the sea and caused them to pass through. And he made the waters stand up like a heap. And he led them with the cloud by day and all the night with a light of fire. He split the rocks in the wilderness and made them drink as from the great depths, and brought forth streams from the rock and caused waters to come down as rivers. Yet they sinned still more against him, to rebel against the Most High in the desert. And they tried El in their heart by asking food according to their desire. And they spoke against Elohim, and they said, "Is El able to set a table in the wilderness? Look, he struck the rock so that the waters gushed out and the streams overflowed. Is he able to give bread also?" And so these things, Paul says in 1 Corinthians 10, were written as examples for us so that we can learn the lessons of our ancestors who hardened their hearts in the wilderness. And so they tested Yah, saying, "We saw all the miracles he did, but can he do more? Can he bring bread to us here in the wilderness?" And that angered Elohim because of all the miracles he had already shown and the provision he had already made. And they said, "Would he provide meat for his people?" And therefore Yahweh heard, and he was wroth. And so a fire was kindled against Yaakov, And displeasure also came up against Israel, because they did not believe in Elohim, neither did they trust in his deliverance. And yet he commanded the clouds above and opened the doors of the heavens, and he rained down manna on them to eat, and he gave them the grain of the heavens. His mercy endures forever. Hallelujah. Men ate bread of the mighty. He sent them provisions to satisfaction. He made an east wind blow in the heavens, and by his power he brought in the south wind. And he rained meat on them like the dust, and winged birds like the sand of the seas, and let them fall in the midst of the camp, all around his dwelling place. And so they ate and were completely satisfied, for he brought them what they desired. And they had not turned away from their desire. Their food was still in their mouths when the wrath of Elohim came against them, and he killed among their fat ones, and he struck down the choice ones of Israel. In spite of all this, they still sinned and did not believe in his wonders. So he ended their days in a breath, and their years in trouble. When he killed them, then they sought him, and they returned and did earnestly seek Elohim. And they remembered that Elohim was their rock, and that the Most High El their Redeemer. But they flattered him with their mouth, and they lied to him with their tongue. For their heart was not steadfast with him, and they were not true to his covenant. But he, the compassionate one, pardoned crookedness, and he did not destroy them. And many a time he turned his displeasure away, and still he did not stir up all his wrath. For he remembered that they were but flesh, a passing breath that does not return. How often they rebelled against him in the wilderness and grieved him in the desert. And again they tried El and provoked the set-apart one of Israel. They did not remember his hand the day when he redeemed them from the adversary. How he worked his signs in Mitzrayim and his wonders in the field of Soan. He turned their rivers into blood, and they could not drink their streams. He sent among them swarms of flies which devoured them, and frogs which destroyed them, and gave their crops to the caterpillar and their labor to the locust. He destroyed their vines with hail, and their sycamore trees with frost. He gave their beasts over to the hail, and their livestock to bolts of fire. He sent on them the burning of his displeasure, wrath, and rage, and distress, a deputation of messengers of evil. He made a path for his displeasure, and he did not spare their being from death, but gave their life over to the plague. And he struck all the firstborn in Mitzrayim, the first fruits of strength in the tents of Ham, and then made his own people go forth like sheep, and he led them in the wilderness like a flock. And he led them on safely, and they did not fear. But the sea covered their enemies, and he brought them to the border of his set-apart place, this mountain which his right hand has gained. And he drove out nations before them, and allotted them a measured inheritance, and made the tribes of Israel dwell in their tents. And yet they tried and rebelled against the Most High Elohim, and did not regard his witnesses. But they turned back and acted treacherously like their fathers. They twisted like a treacherous bow, for they enraged him with their high places, and moved him to jealousy with their carved images. When Elohim heard this, he was wroth and greatly despised Israel. And he left the dwelling place of Shiloh, the tent which he had set up among men. And he gave his strength into captivity, and his comeliness into the hand of the adversary. And he gave his people over to the sword, and he was wroth with his inheritance. His young men were consumed by fire, and his maidens were not praised. His priests fell by the sword, and their widows could not weep. And then Yahweh awoke as from sleep, as a mighty man who shouts because of wine. And he struck his adversaries backward, and he put them to an everlasting reproach. And then he rejected the tents of Joseph and did not choose the tribe of Ephraim, but chose the tribe of Yehudah, Mount Sion, which he loved. And he built his set-apart place like the heights, like the earth. He founded it forever. He chose David, his servant, and he took him from the sheepfolds. And he brought him in from tending the ewes to shepherd Yaakov, his people, and Yisrael, his inheritance. And he shepherded them according to the integrity of his heart and led them by the skill of his hands. And so Asaph says that this is a parable. And what we want to do is we want to try to understand what the message here is. It's a parable in the same sense that Isaiah talked about parables. And that is that some would hear and understand and others would not. They would harden their hearts. And so really Israel, a large portion of the practicing Yehudim, the Jews in Israel, still don't understand this parable because they've hardened their hearts against Yahweh's ways. And I want to make this clear that the Jews in Israel have rejected the Messiah, and they continue to reject him and harden their hearts against him. They still have their own laws and right rulings, which Father gave them over to centuries and centuries ago, really back in the time of the captivity in Babylon, and then on forward from there. And the Jews have continued to operate in their own laws and right rulings. They've hardened their hearts against Yahweh, just as these earlier generations that Psalm 78 describes, how they continue to reject Elohim. And so this is a parable because we understand the hardness of Israel's heart through this parable, and yet they themselves don't understand why they're not being blessed, why they're not walking in Yahweh's favor. And it's because of the hardness of their heart. So I'm going to take a look at what the Messiah said about Israel's hardness of heart. And there are several places where he alludes to their hardness of heart, but it's kind of summarized in this passage in Matthew chapter 23, verses 37 through 39, where he announces, Yerushalayim, Yerushalayim, you who killed the prophets and stoned those sent to you. And it's all, again, because of the hardness of their hearts. They're refusing Yahweh's solutions, how he's trying to draw them back to follow his laws and right rulings, and they reject those prophets and they stone those sent to him. How often, Messiah said, I have longed to gather your children together as a hen gathers her chicks under her wings, but you were not willing. Look, your house is left to you desolate. But so the Messiah came to regather the two houses of Israel, the northern kingdom which was scattered in all the earth, and the southern kingdom as well. And this is what he means when he wanted to gather her chicks together, her children together. Messiah desired to do this and fulfill what the prophets spoke about these things, but they still hardened their hearts. And so at that time, he was still unable to accomplish this for the people living in Israel, for the leadership in Israel during his days. And then he said, for I tell you, you will not see me again until you say, blessed is he who comes in the name of Yahweh. And this, again, was also part of the problem, is that they refused to even speak the name of the Almighty. They had laws set up against speaking the real name of the Father upon pain of death and being kicked out of the synagogue if people were to actually pronounce the name and use the name and speak the name of Yahweh. And so, on account of the hardness of heart, these prophecies were only partially began to be fulfilled in Messiah's day, and yet we're going to see in our future the total fulfillment of them when the Father will gather all of his elect from the four corners of earth and gather his children together as Messiah desires to do. And so Paul talks about Israel's hardness of heart. And I want to show that Paul, the revelation of this mystery in Romans chapter 11, is speaking of that same hardness of heart that the prophets spoke of long ago, and Psalm 78 spoke of, and what Messiah spoke of to the spiritual leadership in Israel during his day. He says, if they do not persist in unbelief, and here Paul is speaking about the Jews who had rejected the Messiah, if they do not persist in unbelief, they will be grafted in. For Elohim is able to graft them in again. And after all, if you were cut out of an olive tree that is wild by nature, and contrary to nature were grafted into a cultivated olive tree, how much more readily will these, the natural branches, be grafted into their own olive tree? And what he's saying is that when the Jews relinquish the hardness of their heart and they receive the Messiah, it's going to be even so much easier for them to be grafted into the Father's ways, because they're already exposed to the law. They know the Hebrew, they know the culture, and they know these things even though they've rejected the Father's word and adopted their own laws and right rulings. When they come to that point of repentance, it will be very natural for them to come back into the vine, into Israel, and be a part of Elohim's plan. And so Paul says, I do not want you to be ignorant of this mystery, brothers, so that you will not be conceited. Israel has experienced a hardening in part until the full number of the Gentiles comes in. And so Paul isn't just talking about something that happened in his day, but it's a hardening of heart of Israel way back hundreds of years prior to Paul's time, when Israel had hardened their hearts against Yahuwah. And they followed out a history of hardening their heart, of which, we've read in Psalm 78 and so forth. So this hardening of heart was being used by the Father to accomplish another part of his redemption plan, and that is to bring the full number of Gentiles into the fold. And so as Israel was scattered, and then later on after Messiah's apostles and prophets were scattered as they were told to do, to go out into all the earth, and this message of Messiah's redemption was proclaimed, Gentiles became receiving this word of the salvation of Yah through the Messiah, and the Gentiles began to come into Israel and were grafted in to the nation, into the people to whom were made the promises. And so this is Paul's mystery of Israel's hardness of heart. It was something that was going on for a long, long time, and was still going on in his day. And Paul wants us to understand that this is part of the Father's plan, to bring in the Gentiles, to bring in the nations of the world, because those to whom these things were given, in that parable that we're going to take a quick look at again, it says that they killed these messengers that were sent and stoned the prophets, and then when the Son came, they said, this is the heir, let's kill him and the inheritance will be ours. But the Father's plan was to allow this to happen in order that the Gentile nations might hear the word and might be able to be grafted in to the natural olive vine. So, taking a quick look at some of these parables that we covered last week, and I just want to quickly review because I feel like I did an inadequate job of explaining the meaning of some of these parables and how they relate to the secrets, the mysteries of the kingdom of Elohim. The mystery or parable of the sower goes like this. He told them many things in parables, saying, a farmer went out to sow his seed. As he was scattering the seed, some fell along the path and the birds came and ate it up. Some fell on rocky places where it did not have much soil. It sprang up quickly because the soil was shallow. But when the sun came up, the plants were scorched and they withered because they had no root. And other seed fell among thorns, which grew up and choked the plants. Still other seed fell on good soil, where it produced a crop, 160 or 30 times what was sown. And so later on in chapter 13 of Matthew, he explains the meaning of the parable of the sower. He says, listen then to what the parable of the sower means. When anyone hears the message about the kingdom and does not understand it, the evil one comes and snatches away that which was sown in his heart. And this is the seed sown along the path. The one who received the seed that fell on rocky places is the man who hears the word and at once receives it with joy, but since he has no root, he lasts only a short time. And when trouble or persecution comes because of the word, he quickly falls away. The one who received the seed that fell among the thorns is the man who hears the word, but the worries of this life and the deceitfulness of wealth choke it, making it unfruitful. And so there are these three seeds that are sown, and people initially hear the word and they receive it and they begin to walk in it, but these various issues come along that choke the word. In other words, they're not able to move forward in that word, and they fall away on account of whatever that difficulty is that comes down their path. He says, but the one who received the seed that fell on good soil is the man who hears the word and understands it. He produces a crop yielding 160 or 30 times what was sown. And so, lessons from the parable of the sower. I want to kind of summarize this for myself so that we understand how this parable relates to the kingdom. Many will fall short of entrance into the kingdom. There's another verse where the Messiah said, many are called but few are chosen. And so the calling is the putting out of the word. Few are chosen, meaning that the seed does not always bear fruit in people because they reject walking out the ways of the Father. They harden their hearts, as our ancestors did in the wilderness. And so many will fall short of entrance into the kingdom, even though they hear the word, they hear the gospel preached to them, and even for a time they may be part of an organization that wants to worship the Father through the Son. Remember our ancestors in the wilderness. Again, this is a lesson that we've learned, that we know is for us, that we need to continue to walk in it and to believe the Father and do the things that He's commanded to us. And so finally, entrance into the kingdom. Here's where the parable relates to the kingdom. Entrance into the kingdom requires a commitment to walking out the faith while overcoming the distractions. So it's not an easy path. You know, Messiah said a lot about that. It's not an easy path. But entrance, just like entrance into the land of Canaan, required the people to follow the Father and not to harden their hearts, and yet they hardened their hearts and failed to enter into the land, which is a foretaste, it's a foreshadow of what it's like for us in our day, and really for all generations, is that we need to hear the message and receive it, and then commit ourselves to it and walk it out and overcome the distractions that would cause us to turn back to Egypt, as it were, to turn back to our old way of life, or to turn back into that mindset where we can receive Jesus into our heart, but we can live our life our own way. And that's not how we enter into the kingdom. There will be failure on a part of those people that have decided that and have decided to follow that kind of thinking. The parable of the weeds, Yahushua told them another parable. The kingdom of heaven is like a man who sowed good seed in his field. But while everyone was sleeping, his enemy came and sowed weeds among the wheat and went away. And when the whole wheat sprouted, slow down, when the wheat sprouted and formed heads, then the weeds also appeared. The owner's servants came to him and said, "Sir, didn't we sow good seed in your field? Where then did the weeds come from?" "An enemy did this," he replied. The servants asked him, "Do you want us to go and pull them up?" And he said, "No, because while you are pulling the weeds, you may root up the wheat with them. Let both of them grow together until the harvest. And at that time, I will tell the harvesters, first collect the weeds and tie them in bundles to be burned, and then gather the wheat and bring it into my barn." And so later on, Yahusha gave an explanation for this parable, and here's the summary of it. The one who sowed the good seed is the Son of Man. The field is the world. The good seed stands for the sons of the kingdom. The weeds are the sons of the evil one. The enemy who sows them is the devil. The harvest is the end of the age, and the harvesters are angels. And so this is how the kingdom of Elohim is going to be ushered in. And this is why this is a parable of the kingdom. The revealing of a mystery of the kingdom is that the Father is going to, at the end of time, he's going to sort out. He's going to send his messengers who, when people have reached a point of maturity and are ready to be harvested, the angels and even we will be able to see the difference between the weeds that were sown by the evil one and the wheat, the righteous ones that were sown by the word of Elohim. And so those will be separated in the end time. The weeds will be burned, and the wheat will be gathered into his kingdom. And we will rule and reign with Messiah at that time. That's my explanation of the parable of the weeds. Lessons from the parable of the two seeds. Our enemy places non-believers in our midst. Ours is not to judge, but to wait for the harvest, and a righteous judgment will occur at the end of the age. Hallelujah. Messiah told them another parable. The kingdom of heaven is like a mustard seed, which a man took and planted in his field. And though it is the smallest of all your seeds, yet when it grows, it is the largest of garden plants, and becomes a tree, so that the birds of the air come and perch in its branches. And this is kind of what Nebuchadnezzar's dream alluded to, is that the kingdom of Elohim started out small, but it grew and it grew and it overthrew those world kingdoms and filled the whole earth. And it says the birds of the air came and perched in its branches. It was so big that everyone was benefiting from this tree, which is a representation of the kingdom of Elohim. So here is a lesson that I found in this. The kingdom of heaven will start small, but will fill the earth. The mystery of the mixing dough, the parable of the mixing dough. He told them still another parable. The kingdom of heaven is like. It's like. And in each of these parables, he says the kingdom of heaven is like something. In other words, we have to see what the comparison is. And it's on account of the fact that it takes some wisdom and discernment to know what this comparison is in order to understand the lesson of the parable. And this is where hardness of heart causes people to misinterpret the likeness or what the kingdom of heaven is being compared to. So they misinterpret and misapply, and then they don't understand the kingdom of heaven. And we see that in a number of places in the doctrines and teachings of some of the Christian churches. So the kingdom of heaven is like yeast that a woman took and mixed into a large amount of flour until it worked all through the dough. And that may seem simple enough. Like in Nebuchadnezzar's dream, the kingdom of Elohim grows to fill the whole earth, and the gospel has to be taken to the ends of the earth for people to hear and to receive. The mixing of the yeast into the dough, I think, is a picture of us taking the gospel and bringing that word and mixing it in among the nations so that they can understand the message of Elohim, and that they can grow and then occupy the kingdom of Elohim. The parable of the hidden treasure, the kingdom of heaven is like, again, a comparison, is like treasure hidden in a field. When a man found it, he hid it again, and then in his joy went and sold all he had and bought that field. And so this parable, I derive at least two lessons. You may find more lessons in this parable, but entrance into the kingdom requires a wholesale forsaking of anything that hinders our walk with Him. In other words, we have to leave what was behind us, the past, and immerse ourselves, or to sell out, if you will, if I can use that phrase, sell out to Elohim and to His kingdom, and invest all that we have in His kingdom, because nothing else that we had been doing can compare with the benefits of walking in His ways and having a wholesale giving of ourselves unto Elohim. A second lesson is, like Abraham, we are called to leave all behind, even our own families if need be. And so, like Abraham left his father's household, we are also called to do the same. And whatever it is that hinders us, whatever it is that holds us back from serving our Elohim, we are encouraged and prompted to leave all that behind. Now, that doesn't mean we don't love our families, our friends, or our church families, or anything like that. But what it means is that we come to a point in time where we have to say, I've brought this message, and now it's up to the Father to work in them, to bring them into an understanding and into a walk in the truth. But I have to move forward now. I have to go where the Father's calling me to go. And so often we have to leave behind. The parable of the fine pearls. Again, the kingdom of heaven is like a merchant looking for fine pearls, and when he found one of great value, he went away and sold everything he had and bought it. Very similar to the previous parable, and it just means that we have to give it up all for Him. And when we buy that fine pearl, it's like buying entrance into the kingdom of heaven. Not that we can literally buy it, but we have to be willing to give up all else. And even with the man who approached the Messiah and said, "What must I do to inherit eternal life?" He said, "Obey the commandments, and then sell everything you have and come and follow me." That's the kind of thing that this parable is describing, as selling everything and following the Messiah. Once again, the kingdom of heaven is like a net that was let down into the lake and caught all kinds of fish, and when it was full, the fishermen pulled it up on the shore. And then they sat down and collected the good fish in baskets but threw the bad away. This is how it will be at the end of the age. The angels will come and separate the wicked from the righteous and throw them into the fiery furnace, where there will be weeping and gnashing of teeth. And so this, as you can see, is very similar to that previous parable that says that the angels are going to come and separate the wheat from the tares. In the judgment, here's what the lesson or the mystery revealed is. In the judgment, there will be a separation of the righteous from the unrighteous. The unrighteous will be cast out, and the righteous will inherit the kingdom. The parable of the landowner, and this is where the seed of Abraham's promise is described and revealed. There was a landowner who planted a vineyard. He put a wall around it, dug a wine press in it, and built a watchtower. And then he rented the vineyard to some farmers and went away on a journey. And when the harvest time approached, he sent his servants to the tenants to collect his fruit. The tenants seized his servants. They beat one, killed another, and stoned a third. And then he sent other servants to them, more than the first time. And the tenants treated them the same way. And so these are all the prophets that Father sent, all throughout the history of Israel. These are the ones that those who were occupying the land rejected it says somewhere that all of the prophets were killed. All the prophets that were sent to Israel were killed. And if you look through the record, they were all killed in Jerusalem. At least there wasn't one that the record shows they were killed somewhere else. But they were all killed in Jerusalem because Jerusalem was the place of Yahweh's dwelling place, his temple. And so the prophets came to try to draw people back into relationship with the Almighty. And so all of those servants were mistreated, and many of them killed. And the parable says, last of all, he sent his son to them. They will respect my son, he said. But when the tenants saw the son, they said to each other, this is the heir. Come, let's kill him and take his inheritance. And so they took him and threw him out of the vineyard and killed him. And so this is where it is revealed, and where Paul comes to understand and describe in the book of Ephesians about who the rightful heir is to the land of Israel, to Abraham's promise, Abraham's seed. And therefore, Messiah continues, when the owner of the vineyard comes, what will he do to those tenants? He will bring those wretches to a wretched end, they replied, and he will rent the vineyard to other tenants who will give him his share of the crop at harvest time. And I'm not sure who the they are that replied to this when he asked the question. Was it his disciples? Was it the religious leaders? Because if the religious leaders understood that he was talking about them, that the religious leaders were the wretched tenants, they might not have said this. But anyway, Yahusha said to them, have you never read in the scriptures? So I guess it was the religious leaders that were saying this. They understood the parable, but they didn't understand the application of the parable, that he was talking about them. Yeah. So they gave the right answer. So he said to them, have you never read in the scriptures? The stone the builders rejected has become the capstone. Yahweh has done this. And it is marvelous in our eyes. And this is from Psalm 118, I believe. Is that right? Psalm 118 sound right? Therefore, he said, I tell you that the kingdom of Elohim will be taken away from you and given to a people who will produce its fruit. And that's when I'm sure they got a little bit indignant and upset when he said, this is about you. And you're going to be stripped of this. And the Father's going to give this kingdom of Elohim to the people that are worthy of it, to those that produce the fruits of it. And so he who falls on this stone will be broken to pieces, but he on whom it falls will be crushed. Those who inherit the kingdom, and this is my summary of the lessons of this parable, those who inherit the kingdom are not necessarily those who are of genetic or genealogic descent of the sons of Israel. In other words, they're not necessarily the natural born sons in Israel who can follow out the DNA and the genealogy. Yahusha is the stone the builders rejected, and he is also the seed of Abraham and the son of the inheritance of the kingdom. And the people that produce the fruit of those are those attaching themselves to Messiah and are repenting and conforming to obedience to the Father's word. And so this is what the parable of the landowner reveals to us, how the kingdom is going to be ushered in. Yahusha really alluded to yet another parable that we're going to take a look at. And that's when he spoke about the mystery of the living and of the dead. In Lazarus, or John chapter 11, when Lazarus had died and Yahusha and his disciples were called to visit the tomb, the sisters of Lazarus came to him. And I believe it was to Martha that Yahusha said, I am the resurrection and the life. Here's a revelation of a mystery that Messiah showed, and of which Paul received his understanding of what happens at the time of Messiah's return. But it was the Messiah that revealed this mystery. I am the resurrection and the life. He who believes in me will live, even though he dies, and whoever lives and believes in me will never die. Do you believe this? He said. And so the Messiah is revealing what is going to happen when he returns. We got different pieces of this scenario from the other parables, including, the harvesters being sent out to gather the wheat into his barn. But here the Messiah is describing for us yet another mystery, something that wasn't understood, and it concerns both the living and the dead. Because the dead, we know, are going to be resurrected, and we get that from what some of the prophets have said. But what's going to happen to the living when he returns? And here the Messiah reveals this. I am the resurrection and the life, he said. He who believes in me will live even though he dies. And so the dead are going to be raised. Those who believe in him and die are going to be raised to life. And whoever lives and believes in me will never die. Do you believe this? He said. And so I suspect that he said more to Martha about these things at that time, but we're given this like summary of what he said about the living and the dead. And so Paul takes this mystery and he explains it a little further. And again, I suspect that it's because Messiah had explained it, and so Paul was basically reiterating what the Messiah taught at this time. In 1 Corinthians 15, he says, "Behold," or "Listen, I tell you a mystery. We will not all sleep, but we will all be changed. In a flash, in the twinkling of an eye, at the last trumpet. For the trumpet will sound, the dead will be raised imperishable, and we will be changed. For the perishable must clothe itself with the imperishable." In other words, the dead have to come to life in order to be clothed with an imperishable body, and the mortal, meaning those who are living, with immortality. So the living will receive immortality at this time, when their bodies will be changed. And so this is the mystery, is that the living and the dead who believe in the Messiah are going to receive an immortal or imperishable body. And then Paul also talks about these things in 1 Thessalonians 4 and reveals further what this mystery entails. For the Master himself will come down from heaven with a loud command, and with the voice of the archangel, and with the trumpet call of Elohim, and the dead in Messiah will rise first. And after that, we who are still alive and are left will be caught up together with him in the clouds to meet the Master in the air, and so we will be with Yahweh forever. And so this is what's going to happen, and this is what has been revealed about the kingdom of Elohim. And this is who will inherit it. Those who believe in him, both the dead and the living, are going to inherit it at that time. They're going to have these immortal bodies that they can that go into the kingdom with. So I'm going to share just one more parable, and then we'll be done for the day. It's a parable that Messiah told. And you may not have thought about this as relating to the kingdom of heaven, but hopefully I'm going to be able to show you a connection to the kingdom of heaven and how it is that we enter into the kingdom of heaven. And it's the parable found in Matthew 15, the parable of what makes a man unclean. It says here, and it's a familiar story, it's a familiar account to all of us. What we might not have thought of this in terms of it being a parable and a revelation of the kingdom of heaven. It says, then some Pharisees and teachers of the law came to Yahusha from Jerusalem, and they asked him, "Why do your disciples break the tradition of the elders? They don't wash their hands before they eat." Okay, so this was the tradition of the elders, as it says here, as the Pharisees alluded to. And it was one of their own traditions. It wasn't a teaching of the scriptures themselves. It wasn't a part of the Torah of Elohim that one must wash their hands before they eat. But they brought in this new law And Yahusha replied to them, why do you break the command of Elohim for the sake of your tradition? So he's laying out a distinction between the tradition of the elders and the command of Elohim, because there's a huge difference. And it's important that we see this difference in order to understand who it is that enters into the kingdom of Elohim. For Elohim said, honor your father and mother, and anyone who curses his father or mother must be put to death. But you say that if a man says to his father or mother, whatever help you might otherwise have received from me is a gift devoted to Elohim, then he is not to honor his father with it. And thus you nullify the word of Elohim for the sake of your tradition. So it was the teaching of the elders that you could take that which was supposed to be dedicated and given as korban, or a gift to Elohim, and instead, a gift to father and mother. I said that all wrong. Taking a portion of money that should have been given to honor your father and mother and saying it is korban, it is a gift to Elohim. And so the elders were saying you can take that which should be given to your parents to honor them and give it to the temple instead. And so Messiah was saying, thus you dishonor your father and your mother by not giving that which belongs to father and mother and honoring them. And thus you nullify the word of Elohim for the sake of your tradition. You hypocrites, Yeshayahu was right when he prophesied about you. These people honor me with their lips, but their hearts are far from me. They worship me in vain. Their teachings are but rules taught by men. And so this is what Yeshayahu was alluding to, is that the leadership in Israel had adopted this policy of following their own traditions and not following or obeying the command of Elohim. And thus their teachings, the teachings of the Pharisees, Sadducees, rabbis, and the elders of Israel, were about following their own rules, the rules that they made up, and not following the commandments of the Almighty. And Yahusha called the crowd to him and said, listen and understand. And here's what we need to understand about what the Messiah was teaching here when he had his disciples eat without washing their hands according to the tradition. What goes into a man's mouth does not make him unclean. But what comes out of his mouth, that is what makes him unclean. And then the disciples came to him and asked, do you know that the Pharisees were offended when they heard this? I bet he knew that. I bet that was the whole purpose of it, was that he wanted to offend them, to get them to think about what it is that they were teaching. And he replied, every plant that my heavenly Father has not planted will be pulled up by the roots. Leave them, they are blind guides. If a blind man leads a blind man, both will fall into a pit. And so these religious rulers were really blind to the ways of Yahweh. And we were reading this week something from Isaiah where he says, there is none blind like my servant. And what he was saying is that his servant Israel was supposed to be following out the ways of the Father, but they were blind. And that's where Yahusha kind of draws this from. It was from what Isaiah said, that my servant is blind and deaf. There is none deaf and none so blind as my servant, because Israel had hardened their heart and had become blind and deaf to the words of Yahweh. And so he said, leave them, they are blind guides. And Kepha, Simon Peter, came to Messiah and said, explain the parable to us. So Peter understood that this was a parable that he told about what goes into the mouth makes it's not what makes a person unclean, but what comes out of the mouth is what makes the person unclean. And so Messiah said, are you still so dull? Don't you see that whatever enters the mouth goes into the stomach and then out of the body? But the things that come out of the mouth come from the heart. And these things make a man unclean. For out of the heart come evil thoughts, murder, adultery, sexual immorality, theft, false testimony, slander. These are what make a man unclean. But eating with unwashed hands does not make him unclean. Very clearly and specifically clarifying what his teaching of unclean was about when he said that which goes into the mouth does not make a man unclean. He's not talking about the things that the Father has declared to be despicable and detestable. Those animals which were made and not to be eaten by mankind. He's not talking about that going into the mouth. He's talking about washing with maybe dirty hands, or eating with dirty hands. And so this is the parable, and this is why that people have hardened their hearts to misunderstand what the Messiah is saying. Because like all other parables, those who have hardened their hearts will misunderstand. Remember what Isaiah said. But those who are believing and listening to the voice of Elohim are going to understand what he's saying. So understand what he's saying. He's not talking about food or pig or any of those other detestable things being eaten. Because those things do defile a man. But what he's talking about is eating with unwashed hands. So Yahushua is not addressing eating what Father has declared to be unclean. People who have hardened their hearts still misinterpret this parable. And that's important to see. People who have hardened their hearts against the law of Elohim misinterpret this parable. They misinterpret what Messiah was saying to suggest somehow that all things are now clean and we can eat whatever we want. And that's not what the Messiah was teaching. So therein is the misunderstanding of this parable by those who have hardened their hearts. The doctrines men teach are what make them unclean. In other words, the words that come out of the mouth, remember he said not what goes into the mouth by eating with unwashed hands, but what comes out of the mouth are what make a man unclean. And he specifically named adulteries and thefts and those kind of things. But he's addressing the Pharisees and the traditions of the elders. And so that which comes forth from the mouth of the elders were their own traditions, their own teachings. And those are what makes a man unclean. The teachings and doctrines of men are what Messiah was talking about here in this parable. That's what makes a man unclean. So therefore, and I want you to see this, that entrance into the kingdom of heaven requires us to reject the traditions of the elders and the doctrines of men, but only to speak truth. And the truth comes from the word of Elohim, which endures and abides forever. And so the parable of what makes a man unclean makes it clear that it's the traditions of the elders that we need to be avoiding, notwithstanding the truth about that which was detestable in Yah's sight and which he described in the Torah. So let's not make the mistake of misinterpreting what the Messiah has said in these parables. There are others as well that we could look at. Mark's version of this story is where the English Bible translations say, in declaring this, Jesus was declaring all things clean, which was totally not what Mark's gospel is saying at all, and the Greek will bear that out, and we looked at that once or twice in the past. But that's not what he's saying. What he's saying is that it's eating with unwashed hands and following the traditions of the elders that is the wrong path to follow, but that we need to be speaking the truth of the word of Elohim and not following or speaking or teaching the traditions of the elders. And so I hope that this summary, I'm going to end right here, this summary of the parables and of the mysteries has maybe become a little bit clearer. I know some of this was review, but when we look at the Torah, we look at old things and new. we look at some of the things that we already covered in the past, and then the Torah also presents to us new things, things that come to light in view of the Scriptures. And so we can learn, continue to grow, and develop an understanding of these things and what it is that the kingdom of Elohim is like. And so that's what I have today. What say you?